All right, welcome to a podcast featuring myself as the host. I'm Captain Disguise. We have with us today Klingschor and GodlessSaudi, and we are here to talk about the inimitability of the Quran. Specifically, we're going to be responding to a video that was made by Imran ibn Mansur, who calls himself Dawahman, so we are going to call him Dawahman too. And he made a video responding to a video that was made by Klingschor on his Orientalists channel called The Inimitability of the Quran.
Yes.
We're just here to discuss the points he has made. Yeah, and forgive us for not being as professional as Dawahman here, but we're gonna try to be as structured as possible, and we're gonna divide this video into three sections. First, we're gonna discuss some minor errors that has happened on Dawahman's part, and then we're going to discuss some of the rhetorical arguments that he put forth, and that involved a bit of sophistry, in my opinion. But that's for you to judge. And then we will get into the main arguments. So one of the first minor errors he made was
for you to actually, the Quran says, create even a chapter like it, and the smallest chapter being 10 verses.
According to Dawahman, the smallest or shortest chapter within the Quran contains, let's just play it again,
The smallest chapter being 10 verses.
10 verses.
I mean, grew up around Muslims, and the first thing that every kid knows is that the shortest surah in the Quran is Surah Al-Kawthar with only 3 verses. But that could have honestly been a mistake. You know, we should not harass him for it.
I think we should.
although it will be fair.
It's not as though there are multiple surahs that are all shorter than 10 verses, such as, for example, Surah 94, which is 8 verses, and Surah 95, which is 8 verses, Surah 97, which is 5 verses, Surah 98, which is 8 verses, Surah 99, which is 8 verses, Surah 102, which is 8 verses, Surah 103, and so on and so forth. It's not as though there is a plethora of surahs with less verses than 10.
Okay, all right. Let's not rub that in his face. I'm pretty sure he's really embarrassed. But just to think about it, like if that mistake was made by one of us, the comment section would be full of Muslims saying how we do not know anything about Islam.
Well, I mean, for example, when Tom Holland made his documentary and Muslims erroneously or dishonestly claimed that he had said that Makkah was not mentioned in the Quran. I mean, that was all people could tweet about, this one tiny supposed error, which turned out not to be an error. But it helps to demonstrate the point. One little tiny mistake, and your entire case is invalidated. I mean, so you're right. I mean, if we had made this mistake, we would have been lampooned. But, of course, I'm not going to I'm not going to repeat the same fallacy by discrediting everything that Dawahman says just because he made such a foolish error in regarding the length of surahs and the shortest surah in the Quran.
Let's move on to the next section of our video, which is to deal with the empty rhetoric, sophistry, and personal attacks that Dawahman made specifically against Klingschor. So the first thing he said was that he does not feel the need to give us a platform or give Klingschor a platform.
And usually I don't respond to these videos because I feel like there's no need to give them a platform.
Dawahman, if you haven't noticed, Klingschor on his Orientalists channel has twice as many subscribers as you do. On his Klingschor channel, he has like 4 or 5 times as many subscribers as you do. So, if anything, we're giving you the platform, so you're welcome.
Yes.
And now we're gonna play a clip of some of the very nice things that Dawahman had to say about Klingschor.
He quotes, and this is just to highlight the idiocracy, right, of such Orientalists, in the sense that they don't take the time to appreciate, understand the Quranic argument in any way, shape, or form, so they just present themselves forward as silly individuals that just look like they're really upset and they're trying to make a case because they're quite sad. Maybe your mum took you off the bottle too early.
Oh, Dawahman, you've hit on my most intimate fear and insecurity. It's true. Like, I mean, yes, of course. I mean, as you can see, if you look at my video, it's a complete emotional mess where I'm just rambling and struggling to string together a coherent point. Whereas, of course, Dawahman's video, as exemplified in that little clip you just witnessed, is, of course, extremely coherent. He manages to just rattle off his points with great concision without, sort of segueing and stumbling around in these kind of sophistry and, ad hominem attacks. So, of course, you've exposed me, Dawahman. What can I say? We might as well just end the podcast now, because really, I'm through. Like, it's the game is up. He's gone to me. I'm an emotional Orientalist who wasn't breastfed sufficiently by his mother.
This was as mature as his interaction with Professor Lawrence Krauss. Just pointing that out. All right, the next point that Dawahman made is actually something that Muslims make a lot, and it's an elementarily fallacious claim.
The Qur'an, it is my book after all. I do know it better than you.
Clearly, I mean, and as a perfect example of how Dawahman knows the Qur'an far more than I do, is his knowledge of the shortest surah, the Qur'an, which is, of course, 10 verses, apart from the almost 24 surahs with less than 10 verses in them.
Other than that, this is actually a very common sentiment that Muslims say. Like, they would actually come up to you and, give an analogy, basically. Like, they would say, if you're going to learn physics from a physicist, shouldn't you learn Islam from a Muslim? I mean, how do they not realize that this is, like, a false comparison? It's a false category error. Like, a physicist is someone who has a degree in physics and, or has studied physics. On the other hand, a Muslim is any illiterate person who can just believe in something.
He just happened
Doesn't
to
mean
be
he has,
Muslim, not
or born.
the result of his studying Islam.
Mm-hmm. Right, believing in something does not give you knowledge of that something. It's
which is why, of course, academics who study Islamic studies on an academic level are equivalent to, or I would posit superior to, Islamic scholars, because what we're judging these people's authority by is the level of research they've put into the matter, not their mere identification as something as glib as I'm a Muslim, ergo I know the Qur'an better than you.
All right, so should we continue to the main arguments?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, so Dawahman accuses Klingschor of not fully understanding the argument from inimitability, which is possible. I mean, I admit I have no idea what the inimitability Quran claim is. And one of the reasons for that is that Muslims have actually never explained it to me. I've read the entire paper from Hamza. He doesn't make an ounce of sense. So if Dawahman can educate us, it would be absolutely wonderful. So here's Dawahman's argument from inimitability.
The first claim that is made in this video, it's basically an attack on the miraculous and inimitable nature of the Quran, right? The argument from the inimitability of the Quran, i.e., you cannot replicate it and it is outside of the capacity of human beings, therefore it is something that is transcendent. Because you cannot provide a naturalistic explanation, you must obviously, the only possible explanation would be supernatural, right? That's the argument in a very kind of basic way, right? Don't worry, I'm going to expand on it a little bit. Now, the Quranic argument is different. See, what the Quran says is, the Quran is inimitable because in the Arabic language, right, there are specific literary forms. For example, you have poetry, you have prose, and you have a combination of the two, which is known as maqama. Now, in poetry, right, you have poetry. When you have literature and poetry, it always rhymes, okay, and it always adheres to the 16 arithmetical patterns of poetry known as the al-bihar, right? The Quran doesn't fall into any of these categories. Okay, there's consensus with regards to this. Yes, the Quran sometimes it rhymes, but in fact, a lot of the time it rhymes. Sometimes it's irregular rhyme. The fact of the matter is, though, it doesn't fall into any of those 16 arithmetical patterns. In fact, a lot of sometimes the speech in the Quran is non-metrical. The other option is prose. Prose, you can divide it into two parts. By the way, there are subcategories of this of literary forms in the Arabic, but they always fall under the categories of either prose and poetry. Okay, so we go to prose, it's even divided up into saj'a, okay, which is rhymed prose, which is basically but it's different to poetry in the sense where there's, I don't want to go into the Arabic too much, but you have saj'a. Then you have mursal, which is straightforward speech, just how I'm talking to you right now. The Quran is neither of these. It is not. It has elements of this, that, and the other, but it takes it and it delivers it in its own unique form. It's not even maqama, a combination of the two, right? It's its own unique piece of literature. And Arab non-Arab, Eastern, Western, Muslim, non-Muslim, secular, non-secular scholars of the Arabic language are in consensus unanimously that the Quran has a unique literary form. Okay, they cannot provide a naturalistic explanation for this unique literary form. It's in the Arabic language, yet it goes outside the scope of the Arabic, to the extent where it's like you're reading this and it's saying it's a speech in which you understand, but it's not a speech that you can create, right? And it's totally outside the scope, and for that reason we say it is a miracle. Why? Because a miracle is something that is outside the productive capacity of nature. You cannot recreate it. You cannot recreate the Quran, therefore it is outside the productive capacity of human beings. Human beings, of course, are natural. There's no causal or logical connection between the Arabic language and the Quran, right? Or human beings and the Quran. For that reason, it is a miracle. And that is the argument from inimitability.
All right. Well, that's quite a lot of assertions in there that need to be addressed.
I'm interested if there's actually any reference to this consensus that he's talking about. He does give one reference, which we will examine later on, and that should have something in store for Dawahman if he's listening. All right, so what you just heard is the argument from inimitability according to Dawahman. And it's not really clear to me how Klingschor has misunderstood this, because he has basically, the argument that he has addressed in his video is more or less what Dawahman presented. But anyways, the first thing Dawahman says about Klingschor's video is that he has misunderstood the argument from inimitability with the argument from plagiarism. For example, Klingschor says that the works of Picasso are considered inimitable or unique by many individuals, and that experts would be able to identify the original from fake ones or imitations. To this, he responds by saying that Klingschor has misunderstood the argument from inimitability with the argument from plagiarism.
You've not understood the difference between the argument from inimitability and the argument of plagiarism, right? You're talking about plagiarism, that's a totally different thing. Of course, the original will always be an original and the copy will always be a copy. But the argument from inimitability necessitates that you cannot even make a copy. Not that you cannot make a copy, but you cannot take the mechanistic features of what it took to actually create that first original and apply that into your own creation. That's the point.
Now, I could be wrong, but according to my understanding, plagiarism means to take the work of another person and take credit for it. I did not hear Klingschor mention anything about plagiarism anywhere in his video, so could you respond to what's going on, because I'm confused.
Sure. Well, essentially, Dawahman's understanding of, or both his understanding of my argument and his reproduction of it was quite messy and convoluted. It was a straw man. I was talking about imitating the works and style of these artists, not merely creating a physical facsimile of their work. So to elaborate my point that I made in the video, and to sort of clarify for Dawahman, who seems unable to comprehend it, one could argue that you cannot surpass or perfectly imitate Picasso's style of painting because Picasso defined the style. So by definition, Picasso is the most perfect example of Picasso's style. Does this mean, does the inimitability of Picasso's work make it divine in origin? Of course not. And nor would the inimitability of the Qur'an, were it the text to possess such a quality, indicate divine authorship. And that was my actual point. This is the point that Dawahman seemed to have missed. Inimitability does not equate to divinity, thus rendering the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran a non sequitur logical fallacy. It does not follow. If Picasso's work were inimitable, which one could argue, since by definition Picasso's style is the most perfect example of Picasso, and anything else cannot surpass his work. If you made that argument, as Muslims make about the Quran and Muhammad being the most perfect example of Arabic literature, it would not follow logically that the text or the art is divine in origin. And Dawahman seems not to have understood that my whole point was that inimitability does not equate to divinity.
So to summarize, you had nothing to say about plagiarism of any form.
No, nothing at all.
And
no, this is something that Dawahman has imposed upon my argument externally.
But Dawahman does have a contention to raise about what you just said. He does not accept that Picasso or Van Gogh are inimitable. He says that their styles, such as Cubism or something else that he probably read off Wikipedia, have been recreated by other individuals. So he does not accept that they're inimitable.
Well, there's a problem with what Dawahman said. For like, he focused on Cubism and not Van Gogh. So I'll respond in kind. I wasn't talking about Cubism in general. I was talking about Picasso in particular. The fact that Cubism existed anterior to Picasso does not change my point about Picasso being the ultimate example of Picasso's style in particular. By definition, no one can surpass Picasso in Picasso's style, as opposed to Cubism in general. Now, the Qur'an was largely revealed in the style of Sajjah prose, in juxtaposition to Dawahman's earlier claims. We'll get back to that later. And Sajjah prose existed long before Muhammad. Therefore, by your same logic, Dawahman, you've just demonstrated that the Qur'an is not inimitable because the predominant genre of the text existed independent and prior to the text. So essentially, if you debunk Picasso's inimitability by claiming that, look, Cubism existed anterior to Picasso, then we debunk Muhammad's imitability by pointing out that the predominant genre of the Qur'an, Sajjah, existed anterior to Muhammad. Now, you could argue that Muhammad's Sajjah in particular was an unprecedented innovation, unique compared to all that had come prior, but so too was Picasso's Cubism in relation to art. Picasso's Brothel of Avignon was a revolutionary, unprecedented artistic innovation, if we trust A World History of Art by Hugh Honor and John Fleming, who tell us that Picasso revolutionized art in his work that I just mentioned, the Brothel of Avignon. This does not make Picasso's work the product of a supernatural agent just because he revolutionized art and in style and production and so forth. Similarly, if Muhammad did in fact revolutionize Arabian prose, Sajjah, this would not render his work divine in origin. To say that it does render the work divine in origin then stipulates that it follows logically that Picasso's Brothel of Avignon was divine in origin, given that it was revolutionary and unprecedented.
However, Dawahman would further contend that even if they were able to invent their own styles, these styles are imitable. Basically, like, one could imitate Picasso's style. Do you actually accept that? Like,
Sure. I mean, by the whole argument about Picasso being the ultimate example of Picasso's style is in response to basically Muslims will say, when you point to other examples of Sajjah, that no, but the Qur'an is the ultimate example of. It's basically a response to sophistry, because there are many works that have both before Muhammad and after Muhammad, very similar to the Qur'an in the such style, such as al-Ma'ari's work. He created an imitation of the Qur'an in Sajjah. And of course, basically the only way to therefore preserve the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran is to argue that if it's not exactly like the Quran, then it's not a proper imitation. And so it's basically, I'm using the same kind of sophistry that Muslims use to argue for the Quran being inimitable, to argue that Picasso's work is inimitable. And so essentially, of course, people can mimic the style of Picasso. It won't be Picasso's work, and so by definition, Picasso is the most perfect example of Picasso's work, but you can still imitate the style to create similar works, and there are many similar works to the Quran. For example, we have the early prose of Qus bin Sa'idah al-Iyadi, which was very, very similar to the Quran, if we trust Islamic tradition. We have the Sajjah of al-Ma'ari mentioned before. There's also, just in general, just the Sajjah of the pre-Islamic soothsayers, which the Arabs of Muhammad's time actually considered to be Muhammad's work to fall into that genre. And the Quran itself records the responses of the Makkans on many instances, saying that Muhammad was simply a kahin, a soothsayer, given that the soothsayers were the ones who produced the Sajjah prose in pre-Islamic Arabia. And so the Quran was simply seen to fit into that genre. Of course, the best example of an early Quran imitation, thus in the style of the Quran, Sajjah, and so forth, is the fabricated or fake Quranic materials that Muhammad's greatest reciters and memorizers seem to have adhered to. And this is interesting because Dawahman completely misses this point that I make in my Orientalist video. And this is actually one of the strongest points in the video, if not the strongest, which is that Muhammad's early followers, his greatest reciters, Ubay bin Ka'b, Ibn Masud, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, and so forth, actually collected Quranic materials that do not appear in the current Qur'an, which tells us two things. Either that the modern Qur'an is incomplete and therefore imperfect, or that the earliest and greatest of the Quranic reciters and memorizers were fooled by fake Quranic materials, which they incorporated into their Quranic collections. And this is not just a simple something as simple as for example, a single verse or two. We're talking about entire chapters that were mistaken for Quranic materials. And I can give you a specific example of this. The reciter, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad once told a tale concerning the son of Adam and some valleys of gold. Ibn Abbas and Anas bin Malik, both of whom allegedly collected their own Quranic manuscripts, were uncertain as to whether this tale was a Quranic verse or merely a hadith. So these two great reciters and memorizers weren't sure. So they were fooled because they couldn't tell whether it was or not. And the collector al-Ash'ari, this is one of the greatest collectors and reciters of the Quran, he was certain in the formative years of Islam he instructed the Arab Muslim colonists of Basra on how to correctly recite the Quran, and in doing so he mentioned a lost surah that contained, among other things, the story of Adam's son and the valleys of gold, not to mention a further missing chapter that resembled one of the so-called Musabihat surahs. And of course Ubay bin Ka'b contested this, but his Quran also contained discrepant Quranic materials not found in the current standardized edition used by most Muslims today, and so on and so forth. Now, I wonder if, but perhaps going back to examples of pre-Islamic or post-Quranic sajja, perhaps GodlessSaudi can fill us in on some of these examples.
Yeah, sure. Well, there was a guy who lived in pre-Islamic Arabia, and according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad actually admired this guy and he liked his sermons. And in one of his sermons, he basically recited a statement that looks exactly like Surah 112, Surah As-Samad,
really?
in which he said, yes, and in which he said, كلا بل هو الله الواحد المعبود ليس بوالد ولا مولود أعاد وأبدى وإليه المآب غدا. So I think this is I want to ask Dawahman, does this fulfill the inimitability challenge? Because to me this sounds exactly like the Quran. In fact, it sounds like Muhammad just copied Qis, and if he think that this does not fulfill the challenge, why not?
And could you actually translate those three Arabic verses?
Well, it has the same meaning of Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is Surah 112. If you read Surah Al-Ikhlas and read this one, and if you understand Arabic, you will see that they have the same content, it's just a different wording.
Because you're talking about Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad.
Yes.
I see. They mean
it has the same content.
Oh, I see.
Say
That's
Allah is one, Allah is the
Yeah.
eternal refuge, he neither begets nor is born, nor to him are there any equivalent.
Exactly.
A little
And,
an anti-Trinitarian.
That's true, because according to Islamic tradition, this person was a Christian. He was not a polytheist. Yeah, so he had the similar ideas to Muhammad.
Oh, I see. That's really interesting. So in that case, Dawahman's claim that the Quranic Arabic cannot be categorized into any of the known Arabic forms of literature, that does not seem to hold up. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Qur'an, approximately 85.9% of the verses within the Qur'an are rhyming prose, and could therefore be seen to fit under the definition of a sajja, which is actually that's a useful point. What is the definition of sajja? Well, according to According to the Oxford University Press's Arabic Literature at the End of the Umayyad period, in the glossary, sajja is defined as balanced and rhyming prose, utterance originating with pre-Islamic soothsayers of primitive style, short and with a single invariable monorhyme at the end of each member. Okay, so in layman's terms, it's short rhyming prose with a monorhyme. So essentially, the rhyme of each verse has to be the same rhyme. Now, of course, some Muslims might try and claim, therefore, that in the Quran it's not sajja, because the monorhyme is broken on occasion. But this perspective ignores the way in which the Quran was revealed. See, Muslims seem to forget this. The Quran was revealed in dribs and drabs over several decades, according to Islamic tradition, and so therefore, rather than exhibiting a single monorhyme as a whole or throughout each chapter, the Quran contains monorhymes in stanzas or verse clusters, and so each stanza of this kind can thus be seen as an independent unit of monorhymed sajja. So basically, for example, it might say un, and then the verse changes and the rhyme and the monorhyme suddenly becomes in at the end of each verse. This doesn't mean that the Quran isn't sajja. It simply means that we have different stanzas with each with a different monorhyme, which reflects the way that Islamic tradition tells us that the Quran was revealed, which was in bits and pieces. Another possible counterclaim that a Muslim might make to disprove that the Quran contains sajja is the fact that the Quranic sajja is sometimes interspersed with discrepant verses that break the overall monorhyme of the verse. For example, a verse might be saying un, and then suddenly a random verse ends with in, and then un continues. So rather than nullifying this sajja characteristic of the predominantly monorhymed Quranic prose, this simply indicates that Muhammad wrote inconsistent sajja, and or that the discrepantly rhymed verses were misplaced in the written Quran from their original context, thus disrupting the monorhyme in their current context. So in other words, when there's a random verse in the middle of a monorhyme that breaks the monorhyme, either it was Muhammad's mistake and he's writing bad sajja, or the verse actually wasn't originally in that context and in the process of the Quran being written was accidentally placed there.
Well, actually, I don't think it's... when he breaks the monorhyme, I don't think it's a mistake because this style existed before Muhammad.
There you go.
Yes. Qais ibn Sa'ida said once, and you can hear that this sermon does not follow the monorhyme. It actually breaks it many times, over and over. He said, يا معشر الناس اجتمعوا فكل من فات فات وكل شيء آت ليل داج وسماء ذات أبراج وبحر عجاج نجوم تزهر وجبال مرسية وأنهار مجرية وإن في السماء لخبرا وإن في الأرض لعبرا. So as you have heard, he moves from one rhyme to another without just exactly like what Muhammad, exactly like Muhammad's styles in the Quran. So I don't think it's a mistake. Just that's his style that he inherits from Arabs. It's not his unique style.
So, is that form called sajja too, or is that another?
Yes, it's sajja.
I see. Okay.
So then, sajja, it doesn't necessarily need a monorhyme in that case. It can
That's
just have it could have multiple mini monorhymes or whatever plural rhymes, I suppose you could say.
Yes.
But another Muslim argument against this Quran containing sajja was actually posited by al-Baqalani, a medieval Muslim scholar who is one of the early champions and codifiers of the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran. We have al-Baqalani and al-Ramani to thank for this doctrine today. And al-Baqalani asserted that the form is subordinate to meaning within the Quran, whereas meaning is subordinate to form within the genre of sajja. Therefore, according to al-Baqalani, no part of the Quran is sajja. This claim is false on both counts. Both premises are false. Firstly, the second premise was shown to be inaccurate by medieval Arabic scholars who noted that meaning is not necessarily subordinate to form in sajja. And my source for that is Devon Stewart's Sajja in the Quran, Prosody and Structure, in Andrew Rippin's edited piece, The Quran Style and Contents, published by Ashgate Publishing Limited in 2001. On page 106. And essentially, the second premise which is that form is subordinate to meaning within the Quran, the first premise is also false. There are countless examples of meaning subordinate to form within the Quran. Often the words and terms, and therefore the message and content employed within the text, were dictated by the rhymed aesthetic of the Quran. And it is demonstrable that Muhammad often resorted to repeating prefabricated rhymes or distorting words to maintain the rhymed form of his sajah prose. An example of a prefabricated rhyme is the phrase God is most forgiving, Ghafur, most merciful, Rahim, which appears at least 70 times in the Quran and is often tacked onto the end of a verse in order to preserve the rhyme of Muhammad's sajah. An example of a word distorted to maintain the Quran's rhymed form is Sinai, which or usually appears as Tor as-Sana, which is modified to Tor as-Sanin in Surah 95 verse 2 in order to uphold a consistent rhyme within the verse. The use of these two syntactical devices, prefabricated rhymes and distorted words, proves that meaning is often subordinate to form within the Quran, thus falsifying al-Baqalani's apologetics. In other words, this assertion to try and disprove that sajah is present in the Quran is fallacious. And Theodor Noldecker actually notes numerous instances where Muhammad revealed the content of the Quran for purely aesthetic purposes, rather than simply adjusting words and verses to preserve rhyme. Examples of this usually involve the specific number of items mentioned in the Quran, such as the number of angels around God's throne, the number of gardens in paradise, and the number of fountains within gardens, etc. These numbers were chosen to maintain the rhyme of the Quranic verses, demonstrating once again that meaning is often subordinate to form within the Quran. And my source for that is Theodor Nodecker's The Quran, as it appears in Ibn Warraq's edited work, The Origins of the Quran. Now, mind you, not all works of sajah require these kind of syntactical crutches. Muhammad was writing quite poor sajah, you could say, given that he had to constantly rely on twisting words to fit a rhyme, or just these constant prefabricated verses that he just threw in there whenever he wanted to, finish a surah or finish a verse. Many times with a prefabricated rhyme. So to take but one example, the medieval Persian Muslim historian Muhammad al-Isfahani wrote an entire chronicle of the Crusades, the Kitab al-Fatah, in rhymed sajah prose. Al-Isfahani's work is coherent and detailed despite consistently rhymed sajah format, without needing to constantly rely upon such syntactical devices as prefabricated rhymes or distorted words. So Muhammad, not only was Muhammad writing sajah, but he was writing bad sajah.
I mean, in fact, as far as my understanding goes, like, if the Quran, which was compiled over, as you said, 23 years in Muhammad's lifetime, that had to talk about different things, according to the circumstance, if that was actually written in sajah throughout, that would be more miraculous. Instead of being sajah somewhere and something else somewhere else, it would have been more elegant and
exactly. Whereas now, of course, we simply have a Quran predominantly written in sajah, but also written in unrhymed prose,
which is what you would expect.
Exactly.
Right, so...
I mean, this is what Muslims don't seem to understand, and I was talking to a Muslim earlier today, and she didn't understand this either. The Quran is precisely what you would expect, given the milieu depicted, given the sequence of events depicted by Islamic tradition. It is precisely what you would expect. I mean, in pre-Islamic Arabia, you had the Kahins, who, when inspired by a jinn, would have these episodes of these ecstatic sort of trances, and then after the trance they would produce, or even during the trance they would produce their sajah prose, often with invocations to natural phenomena such as the sun and the moon and nature and so forth. And then, of course, at this time Arabia was slowly becoming Christianized, as there were Christians now spreading throughout Yemen, in Hadramaut, in al-Bahrain, Oman, even the island of Socotra off the coast of Yemen. And of course, Abyssinia, not to mention Syro-Palestine and Mesopotamia. And so, of course, the culture of Arabia was becoming Christianized. And what happens? Of course, now we have Kahins but instead of being inspired by a jinn, being inspired by an angel. And so, of course, here we have Muhammad, inspired by Gabriel, having these trances. Islamic tradition describes these quite horrible trances where he would be, his face would go funny colors, his eyes would roll back, he would have all these amazing trances. And then, what would he do? When Muhammad had his first experience with Jibreel, what happened? He ran home to Khadija, and what did he say to Khadija? What was his words to her? Cover me, cover me, cover me. And this is what the Kahins would do. They would cover their heads and recite this sajah. And Muhammad, of course, is reciting sajah as well. Exactly in the same style, the same procedure, the same format as the Kahins before him, except in his case, he was inspired by the monotheistic God and not polytheist. The Quran is exactly what we would expect given the milieu.
GodlessSaudi, is there something else you wanted to add, or?
Yes, I just want to give the source for Qis's sermons. You can find them in Ibn Kathir's book, Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya. He has a whole chapter on Qis bin Sa'ida and some of his sermons and hadith about how the Prophet used to hear his sermon. Like he was present when Qis was alive, before Islam.
I see. Does Ibn Kathir have an opinion about whether the poetry or the sajah is similar to the Quran, or does he mention anything about that?
No, actually he doesn't. He just talks about it from a historical perspective.
I see. All right, so as far as my understanding goes, it seems like the reason that Muslims claim the Quran is not sajah is based on it not being completely sajah, or
it's based on the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran. Because Muslim scholars began with the presupposition that the Quran is from God, and in order to defend the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran, which was only developed, by the way, in response to Christian Arabic criticisms of the Quran, because Christian Arabs were reading the Quran, such as Abdul Masih al-Kindi, and pointing out just how incoherent it was. And so in response to this, Muslims promulgated the doctrine that the Quran is actually linguistically perfect, sort of to defend Islam from this polemical attack. And al-Rumani and al-Baqalani are the early champions of this. And so it is this doctrine that forces Muslims to conclude that the Quran cannot have any kind of human convention in it. It doesn't conform or follow any human styles. It's for doctrinal reasons. It's not actually based upon a sort of an honest appraisal of the Quranic text. And I mean, there were some Muslims who actually put aside the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran and actually examined the Quran honestly, such as Diya ad-Din ibn al-Athir, who, upon examining the Quran without the presupposition of Ijaz al Quran, concluded that a very large part of the Quran is sajah. And my source for this is, of course, Devon Stewart's Sajah in the Quran, cited previously. Although, I mean, of course, but the majority of Muslim scholars, with the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran, the presupposition of Ijaz al Quran in place, of course, refused to acknowledge that there were any Sajah in the Quran. And As-Suyuti, from this same source I just cited before, As-Suyuti states that the majority of the scholars do not allow the use of the term sajah in the context of the Quran, which in turn is taken from As-Suyuti's Al-Itqan.
Yeah. Ibn Khaldun mentioned that the Quran has sajah in it, but it's not as a whole sajah. So he acknowledged that the Quran contains sajah.
So the Muslim claim here seems to be that, I mean, you said that 85% of the Quran is rhymed prose and the rest is unrhymed. And the Muslim claim seems to me that because of that condition, because some of it is rhymed and another part is not, that's the reason to call it not sajah and outside of Arabic literature.
No, well, see, the Muslim counterclaims are actually very telling as to the intellectual dishonesty of this, because Muslims have claimed all kinds of things, like al-Baqalani saying that the whole thing of the issue of style over form and form over style, and there's many examples of this. Like, and if you read the article I just cited, which is Devon Stewart, he goes through some of these, and it's just Muslim scholars would just arbitrarily throw out all these different kinds of little arguments, including the one you just cited, which was actually one of the ones that Dawahman gave. He claimed that isn't entirely rhymed or prose and so forth. It's just really what it comes back to is They begin with the presupposition that the Quran is the perfect word of God, and that it is Ijaz, and that therefore it does not conform to any human conventions, and that's where they begin their analysis.
Okay, since I'm pretty sure there's a lot more to be said about this, but we'll leave it there and move on to the other claims. But in summary, what has happened so far is that the Dawahman has accused Klingschor of misunderstanding the argument from inimitability with an argument that Klingschor actually never made. Now, the next contention raised by Dawahman is that there is a consensus among Muslim and non-Muslim Arabic scholars or Quranic scholars that the Quran is unique and miraculous. He does not cite any sources for this, so I was a bit suspicious. Do you have any idea of such a consensus?
Well, I mean, I think imagine that amongst Muslim clerics you'd find such a claim for doctrinal reasons, as mentioned previously. But amongst non-Muslims, and even, I mean, I've never ever come across this claim by a non-Muslim academic saying that the Quran is miraculously unique. They only ever mention it being unique in the sense that it was the first Arabic book. And in that sense, you could say it's unique, but it's not miraculous in that sense. This idea that it's like linguistically unique. This is something that I've never really come across. Particularly, for example, I mean, many, and it seems the majority of non-Muslim scholars seem to think that the Quran is actually in an identifiable styles. And most, for example, Malise Ruthven notes that the Quran is mostly in Sajjah, or that the early half of the Quran, the Makki verses, are in Sajjah. Malise Ruthven says that it is significant that the first revelations which he, Muhammad, uttered resembled the Sajjah of the Kahins in both form and content. The earliest surahs, chapters of the Quran, consist in the main of shamanistic invocations of natural phenomena in short, ecstatic breaths of rhyming prose. Mullasign Arnold says, and that was from Malise Ruthven's Islam in the World, page 335. Mullaisen Arnold notes that before the Hijrah, the Quranic recitation was rhythmically greatly resembling that of the Arabian soothsayers. Maxime Robinson says, as a matter of fact, in the earliest revelations which he attributed to his God, the forms of the words he heard and repeated is identical to the words which the Spirit breathed into these desert seers. As in the case of the Kahins, the desert seers, the soothsayers, the words fell into short, disjointed phrases, probably thrown out in violent convulsions, more or less fully rhymed. This is what is called in Arabic the Sajjah, or rhymed prose. And that was our Parrot says the Quran is written throughout in rhyming prose, and so forth. You can find many, if not most, academics of Islam who note that the earliest part of the Quran was Sajjah.
And as you said earlier, that there were a few Muslim scholars who agreed that the Quran is also in Sajjah. So
yeah, well, in fact, cited earlier, Dia actually said that almost every surah in the Quran contains some Sajjah, and that many surahs, including Surah 54 and Surah 55, are entirely in Sajjah. And El-Kalkashandi adds that Surah 53 is also an entirely Sajjah surah.
So, all right. So, as far as this claim about the consensus is concerned, given that Dawahman has not provided any reference for this claim, and given that there are actually many non-Muslim as well as a few Muslim sources who disagree with it, it's not really clear if there is such a consensus, and if there is, we'd be happy to change our minds. But the next point that Dawahman raises is that Klingschor uses a fallacious argument from authority by quoting al-Razi. Now, okay, before we get into that, I just need to clarify something. The argument from authority is not necessarily a fallacy. It's what's called an informal fallacy, which basically means that it's fallacious depending on the context. So, for example, if I wanted to say something about, let's say, ancient Egypt, it wouldn't be wrong for me to quote an Egyptologist like Kentar Weeks, who's actually a very established and famous Egyptologist. On the other hand, a fallacious argument from authority would be to get a Canadian embryologist who knows nothing about Arabic and say that the Arabic in the Quran contains modern science. Now, that would be an example of an argument from authority, an argument from false authority. Anyway, so did you actually use al-Razi as an authority on the Quran?
Wow, that's a good question. Let me just go through my script right now from my video, and this is the script that I used and recited to the letter as the audio for my video. And what do I say? Let's see. First I talked about how the inimitability of the Qur'an is not a miracle, but rather the creation of dogmatic Muslim scholars and clerics keen to bolster their religious faith. And then I gave al-Razi as an example of someone who of a response to the claim of Ijaz al Quran. I simply cited al-Razi as an example of how someone has responded. I said precisely, Muhammad bin Zakaria al-Razi, one of the greatest polymaths and intellectuals of the golden age of Arabic science, responded to the claims of such ideologues as follows. And then I gave his quote. And then later on in the conclusion of my video, I simply noted Arabic-speaking intellectuals such as al-Razi have expressed their disdain at the Qur'an challenge and deemed it met already. So at no point did I actually use al-Razi as an authority for any of my claims. I simply proffered his opinion as an example of a response to Ijaz al Quran.
Mm-hmm. Or as it occurred to me, it seemed like you were just offering an opinion of one of the greatest scientists and polymaths of medieval Islamic Golden Age, and his attitude towards the Quran. I mean, that's all I got from it.
That's exactly right. And of course, Dawahman, in his usual tact, it seems, strawmanned my argument and made it into something.
However, yes, that has been happening a lot today. And however, there is something else that Dawahman has said about al-Razi that I actually find a bit uneasy to listen to. But anyways.
The Quran says, create even a chapter like it, and the smallest chapter being 10 verses. So if it's within the productive capacity of human beings, create one chapter like it. Well, for you to do that, you have to do it in the Arabic language, because that's what the challenge necessitates. Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi was Persian. He wasn't even an Arab. Shame, man, it's a shame.
It really is a shame.
So
no, I agree.
funny.
I agree. It really is a shame that he actually said something like that. I mean, think about it. Like, he did not say anything about the knowledge of, or whether al-Razi had the knowledge of Arabic. That's not what his point was. He just dismissed him because he was Persian. That's all he said. It just sounds really racist and bigoted to me. It's just my opinion.
No, I think it is racist. I think that is a very racist argument. I think an equivalent argument to what Dawahman said would be for me to just say, for example, oh, Neil deGrasse Tyson is black. Who can't have any opinion on science? Let me give a better analogy. Okay, now the Bible was written in Greek, and so Bart Ehrman, who is a very modern, prestigious, and seminal scholar of biblical studies and New Testament studies, is not Greek. So of course he cannot have any opinion. All his works and all his criticisms of the New Testament are invalid because it's written in Greek and produced by Greeks, and he is not Greek. Of course,
yeah.
that is a racist argument right there. I mean, what Dawahman seems to be deeply ignorant of is the fact that the religion of Islam and Arabic literature were defined and established by Persians. I mean, for example, let's just consult the works of a little-known historian and the father of sociology, Ibn Khaldun, who says that the founders of Arabic grammar were Sibawayh, and after him, al-Farisi, and Az-Zajjaj. All of them were non-Arab, Persian descent. The Hadith scholars,
right.
most of the Hadith scholars who preserved the tradition of the Muslims were also non-Arabs, Persians, or Persian in language and upbringing. And the same goes for every field. Arabic lexicography, Arabic philology, Arabic prosody.
Could you give any examples if you have any? And GodlessSaudi could, if you have any examples too.
Here. The the Arabic language. I mean, for example, Khalil bin Ahmad al-Farahidi first established the literary theory of Arabic lexicography and phonetics in his seminal work Kitab al-Ain. His most notable student, Sibawayh, was Persian, who went on to establish and define Arabic grammar, and Sibawayh is generally considered to be the greatest Arabic linguist in history.
Yeah,
I mean,
Sibawayh was called Imam al-Arabiya, which means the Imam of Arabic language, and they also called him Shaykh al-Nuha, which means the Sheikh of grammar, and he was a Persian.
But also, most of the major muhaddiths were Persian. Al-Bukhari was from Bukhara, Persia. So, I mean, Muslim an-Naysaburi, as-Sijistani is from Sijistan, Persia. I mean, most of the major muhaddiths were either ethnically Persian or culturally Persian. I mean, it's the early. I mean, it's the same with everything. I mean, Islamic theology, Islamic law, Islamic, traditions, everything. Persians played a huge, and especially in the Arabic language. Arabic language was defined by Persians. So this kind of argument that, al-Razi was a Persian, ergo debunked, is just demonstrates a monumental ignorance on Dawahman's part as to the history and development of Arabic and also the religion of Islam and the role that Persians played therein.
And to back up with the words he himself used, that really was a shameful thing to say. But anyways, let's forget what he said. But bringing it back specifically to al-Razi, did he speak Arabic and did he write works in Arabic?
Yes, he actually studied Arabic literature and philosophy and also medicine and many other subjects. And he authored Kitab al-Hawi, which was in Arabic. It's about medicine, and it was in Arabic. And al-Madkhal al-Ta'limi, which was a book in philosophy too, it was in Arabic. So yeah, he wrote many books in Arabic and Persian.
Mm-hmm. So to sum up, what Dawahman said could not be any more ignorant.
That's right.
Anyways, we'll leave that chapter behind and we'll address another point raised by Dawahman, which appears in the form of a quote from a 19th century Orientalist named Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot. It's kind of funny that just 3 minutes ago he actually said that an argument from an authority is fallacious, and in this case, if the quote actually worked, it would be an argument from authority. But anyways, Here's what Dawahman had to say.
The notable British Orientalist Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, he writes, and that though several attempts have been made to produce a work equal to it as far as elegant writing is concerned, none has yet succeeded. Okay,
but the interesting thing is that this quote is a quotemined, which is not that surprising given that he got this quote from an essay which was published on a website called Inimitability.com, which is maintained by Hamza Tzortzis, who is kind of famous for his quote mining and bad researching. But in this case, the full context of the quote is the following. Arbuthnot says, "It has been said that in some cases grammarians have adapted their rules to agree with certain phrases and expressions used in it," referring to the Quran, and that though several attempts have been made to produce a work equal to it, as far as elegant writing is concerned, none have as yet succeeded. So what he's essentially saying is that he's repeating or reporting what Muslims claim about the Quran. He's not himself endorsing this claim. All right, the other claim made by Dawahman is that the Arabic masters of 7th century failed the Quranic challenge.
Arabs themselves were never able to contend to this. For example, Walid bin Mughira, who was a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he says, and I quote, "And what can I say? For I swear by Allah, there is none amongst you who knows poetry as well as I do, nor can any compete with me in composition or rhetoric, not even in the poetry of jinns," i.e. the spirits. "And yet I swear by Allah, Muhammad's speech," referring to the Qur'an, "does not bear any similarity to anything I know. And I swear by Allah, the speech that he says is very sweet and is adorned with beauty and charm." So this is a master of poetry, a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that is saying that we cannot contend to it.
What he doesn't mention is the fact that all these claims do come from Islamic sources, so from a skeptical point of view, we have enough suspicion to actually question its veracity, but I think Klingschor has a few things to say about this regardless.
Well, of course, Dawahman gives the classic episode from Walid bin Mughira, and this is actually there's a couple of narratives similar to this, where when the greatest poets of Muhammad's time heard the Qur'an, they were just moved and they just converted to Islam. Of course, this is a propaganda narrative. There's certainly no validity to this in terms of authenticity of the story. I mean, Islamic tradition itself contradicts this. We have stories from Islamic sources of another poet, another bin al-Harith bin Qalada, who would accuse Muhammad of plagiarizing from ancient stories, pre-existing stories, and who would go around and recite his own poetry or prose around Muhammad and say, look, everyone, mine is far superior to Muhammad's. And for this indiscretion, Muhammad had another beheaded. Following the Battle of Badr, when another was captured by Muhammad's men. And Muhammad explicitly had another killed for this blasphemy. And now, the question, of course, is, if another's Qur'an imitations and criticisms of Muhammad were insubstantial, then why did Muhammad have him killed for it? But we can go beyond this, because the Qur'an itself records on numerous instances, as I mentioned previously, that the Quraysh considered it to be very poor indeed, and they ridiculed Muhammad and laughed and pointed out that he was simply repeating pre-existing materials, and that he was simply like a kahin, one of the soothsayers, majnoon, jinn-possessed.
And actually, in Surah 25, verse 4, they dismissed him as forgery, as being just fabricating older tales and myths.
So these are found in the Quran itself.
Yes. And you mentioned, Klingschor mentioned another bin al-Harith who tried to imitate the Quran and was killed by Muhammad. Actually, there is a verse in the Quran that talks about this person. Surah 8, verse 31. It says, and when our verses are recited to them, they say, we have heard, if we willed, we could say something like this. This is not but legends of the former people. If you read the tafsir for this verse, it's mentioned that this verse was revealed after the incident of another ibn al-Harith trying to imitate the Quran.
I see. What verse was that?
This is verse 31, Surah 8.
And it's essentially saying that the Quran itself is saying that there were people at Muhammad's time who said that they could do what Muhammad has done.
It mentioned that this person, which is the tafsir, claimed to be another, actually challenged the Quran. He said, I can produce something like it. And of course, Muhammad had him killed.
I see.
And there are many Quranic verses. For example, 1747 notes that Muhammad is majnoon, possessed by jinn. Surah 25 verse 8 says the same thing. Surah 52 verses 29 to 30 know that Muhammad is a mad kahin. Surah 69 verses 40 to 42 also state that Muhammad was a kahin, or at least this is what the Muhammad's audience was saying about Muhammad, and Muhammad's response to this audience includes the audience criticism and then Muhammad's response to that within the Quran. So, I mean, this tells us that the Arabs of the time, this time when Dawahman tells us that this was pristine, perfect Arabic, the Arabs at the time, most of them rejected Muhammad and noted that his Arabic was bad, his Quran was bad, and that it certainly wasn't something worth following. Which, of course, raises the question of why it was that all these narratives in Islamic tradition feature these great poets who, when they just heard the Quran, were mystified by it and converted to Islam. Clearly, this is propaganda invented by later Muslims trying to preserve and bolster the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran.
Yes, and actually, if you read the the challenge verses, or they call them, like in Surah 2, verse 23. And if you are in doubt as to that which we have revealed to our servant, then produce a chapter like it. If you read the chapter, if you read the verse after that, it says, "But if you do not, and never shall you do it, then be on your guard against the fire of which men and stones are the fuel." So the author already presupposed that no one would be able to do that. And even if you tried, you wouldn't be able to. So they already made up their mind about this challenge. Like, it's not an open challenge. It's already the results are already revealed. Like, no one would be able to do it.
But that could, from a Muslim standpoint, that could just be Allah being really confident.
That's true.
So let's move on to the next point. All right, the next point that Dawahman makes is something about the evolution of Arabic, which I actually found extremely confusing. But I've tried my best to present it, and here's what I was able to gather. Klingschor made a point about how much of the Arabic grammar was made retrospectively to suit the Quran. And somehow, and I have no idea how, Dawahman understood what Klingschor said to mean that Klingschor thinks pre-Islamic poetry was invented after the Quran. I watched Klingschor's video like 5 times already, and I could not gather it, and I have no idea how anyone could gather it. But anyways, what do you think about what has happened here, and what is the reason for this confusion?
I don't know if it's deliberate. I mean, I don't know. I mean, perhaps it was just the ad hoc fashion in which Dawahman constructed his video response. But it blew me away. I mean, he completely ignored or misunderstood. I don't know I can't tell if it's deliberate or not, but it's just a complete straw man. I mean, he completely misses my entire argument and goes on this massive tangent about Jahili poetry. I don't understand it. What can you do?
Actually, we should play the clip.
And this brings me on to another contention that was made in the video by a lot of Orientalists, that the Arabic actually evolved. That the Arabic evolved after the Qur'an, right? So
he understood.
What he's actually saying was that the Qur'an was one of the source texts of the Arabic grammar. However, grammatical nuances in the Qur'an could not be justified by their existence in the Qur'an on its own. They had to be supported by extra Qur'anic texts such as pre-Islamic poetry, as I just stated. And we can actually historically prove this, okay? Because if you study these pre-Islamic poems that are there, because the argument is, and you'll see how weak it is, that these poems were created 4 centuries after the Qur'an had been revealed, and they were derived from the Qur'an. So it's a non-sequitur argument, because the Arabic language derives from the Qur'an, it doesn't follow. So you can't say that the Qur'an is something special, or the Arabic language is something special. The argument is special because the language itself comes from the Qur'an. Well, I mean, explain to me, if these poems were created many years after, why these poems discuss historical issues in the way that they do. They discuss historical occurrences in pre-Islamic Arabia that could not have been stored in any other way, for the Arabs at that time did not have a means by which they could preserve their history. There was no means by which they could preserve it, okay? So it's not like they could have made these poems 4 centuries after, because the history was therefore extinct, right? But the fact that it's there, and you mentioned his pre-Islamic history, and the fact that those poems are there, and the fact that the eloquence of the poems is at a much higher level compared to the Arabic of today, right? And compared to the Arabic of the 10th century, it's an incoherent argument. And there is not a single person in their right mind that has actually studied, right, this topic that would actually postulate such an argument.
And he just goes on. He just goes on to make that massive argument about. He goes on to make a lengthy argument about how pre-Islamic poetry was. Pre-Islamic poetry was actually, genuinely pre-Islamic and wasn't invented after the Qur'an, which is not what I was arguing. I was arguing that the rules and conventions of the Arabic language were developed and defined after the Qur'an had been revealed. And in many cases, the Qur'an was actually the yardstick by which Arabic was measured henceforth.
All right, so to summarize what happened here, as with all the other claims, Dawahman is accusing Klingschor of misunderstanding an argument which he, again, never made. And to the last point made by the Dawahman, he claims that Klingschor is not aware, Klingschor and Orientalists like him are not aware of how the Quran was preserved. And his claim is that the Quran was entirely written down before Muhammad's death. Now, whatever the veracity of that claim is, the interesting thing is he is trying to respond to what I thought was the most brilliant claim or a brilliant point made by Klingschor in his video, except that Dawahman completely missed that and never even addressed it. So, do you want to explain what your point was?
Well, as I mentioned previously in this podcast, after Muhammad's death, the greatest reciters and memorizers of the Quran could not agree on what was genuinely the Quran of Muhammad and what was fake or interpolated material. And so after, Ubay bin Ka'b, Ibn Masud, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari are just great examples of this. And actually, these men ended up compiling independent and discrepant Quranic collections in the decades following Muhammad's death because they could not agree on what was true and what was not true, which leaves us with an impasse. Either the Quran as it exists today is missing materials, which these greatest reciters and memorizers of the Quran knew about and which for some reason were omitted from the current Quran, or the greatest reciters and memorizers of the Quran, the men who in any point in history were probably in the best position to be able to discern a true Quran from a fake Quran, having heard it firsthand from Muhammad and being Muhammad's greatest reciters and memorizers, these men were fooled and duped by extra Quranic material that does not appear in the current Quran today.
In fact, to do more justice, instead of calling it Quran, what we should be saying is that there were people, the closest companions of Muhammad, the greatest reciters, they were unable to distinguish from Muhammad's speech from what is allegedly Allah's speech. And that point was never addressed. Like, he did not even touch upon it. I don't think he even understood it, or maybe he did not really watch Klingschor's video, but then this has been the theme throughout Dawahman's video. He clearly does not understand or does not show any sincerity to actually address what Klingschor is saying.
Well, the thing with what Dawahman has done, it's very clear, as always is the case, is that Dawahman is not responding because I have actually made any mistakes. Dawahman is responding to preserve his religious ideology. It's not like there's no intellectual integrity here. I mean, Dawahman has repeatedly strawmanned and misunderstood or mischaracterized my arguments repeatedly. Almost every single point, he has not understood or misconstrued my argument, which demonstrates to me that he's not really concerned with properly addressing my arguments. This is just sort of like a knee-jerk emotional defense of his holy book and the doctrine of Ijaz al Quran with which he has clearly been indoctrinated. So it's a little bit disappointing, but I mean, I wouldn't expect anything less from religious ideologues who are only really concerned with defending their religion and not really concerned with the truth or trying to understand an approximation of the truth.
And GodlessSaudi, do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah,
or do you have any questions for...
I just want... I have a question, actually. I just want to ask Dawahman, why didn't any Muslim try to produce something like the Hindu text or try to imitate it? Is that because it's divine, or is there any other reason for this silence from Muslims? Why didn't they ever try to produce something like the Hindu script?
I mean, it makes sense, right? If they really did believe in Ijaz al Quran, it makes sense that they would actually make a big effort to try and imitate every other holy scripture just to demonstrate how they can all be, mimicked, but the Quran cannot. So why has this not been done? Okay, so just to quickly summarize everything that we've covered here, we noted in the beginning how Dawahman made an error as to the shortest chapter in the Quran. He said that there were the shortest chapter in the Quran is 10, whereas in actual fact there are numerous shorter chapters, including Surah Al-Quran, which has 3 verses and not 10 verses. He went on to pad out his video with a lot of invective and sophistry and personal attacks. Most of these are just what you would expect, although one in particular was quite humorous given the first point about his error concerning the shortest chapter, which is that he knows the Quran better than us, and it's his book, which is ironic and clearly not the case given such massive errors as the statement that the shortest chapter in the Quran has 10 verses, when in actual fact it has 3 verses. Next, we went on to his argument on inimitability, and after giving us the argument of inimitability, he went on to strawman or misunderstand my own arguments. He claimed that I confused inimitability with plagiarism, which was not the case. He claimed he went on to make some points about Picasso, which was also not the case. He claimed that Picasso was not basically innovative and that he was within a style, whereas in actual fact Picasso's work was an innovation, which then an analogy can be drawn there with the Quran. He went on to talk about Arabic poetry and claimed that the Quran does not contain any sajja or unrhymed prose. This is false. The Quran is mostly composed of sajja, rhymed prose, but also unrhymed prose. He went on to claim that there is a consensus that the Quran is unique, but he never really cited any source for this consensus. At least for, I was able to find a source for the consensus amongst Muslim scholars, which he did not provide, which my source was As-Suyuti via the article by Devon. And of course, there is no consensus amongst non-Muslim academics. And I actually ended up giving a lot of quotes about how most non-Muslim academics consider the Quran to be composed largely of sajja prose. Next, he went on to claim that I used a fallacious argument from authority quoting al-Razi. This was false. I did not use al-Razi as an argument, as an authority for my argument. I simply gave al-Razi's quote as an example of a response to Ijaz al Quran. Next, he went on to claim that because al-Razi is Persian, this therefore disqualifies al-Razi from having an opinion on this, ignoring the fact that Persians such as Sibawayh were instrumental in the development and the establishment of Arabic and Arabic grammar and lexicography and philology and so on and so forth. Next, he gives a quote mine from Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, quote mine, which is actually derived from Hamza Tzortzis' paper. Next, he goes on to claim that Arabic masters failed the Quran challenge, giving the quote from al-Walid bin al-Mughira, which of course is ignoring, for example, the episode of An-Nadr bin al-Harith bin Qalada, and ignoring the fact that it's quite likely that the story of al-Walid is false, given the way that the Quran itself records the response of most of the Arabs at the time, which was they considered the Quran to be nothing more than sajjah, and Muhammad to be majnoon, a majnoon kahin, a jinn-possessed soothsayer, given the sort of material that he was producing. They didn't think highly of it, in other words. And after this, he gives a counter-argument to my claim that the Quran was instrumental in the development of Arabic, and that the Arabic grammarians and linguists actually structured Arabic after the Quran to reflect the Quran. And in his counter-argument to that, he defends the integrity of Jahili poetry, a complete straw man, completely missing my argument. And then he goes on to give the point about the preservation of the Quran, when he completely misses my argument, and my argument actually debunks this. My points about how the greatest reciters and memorizers of the Quran could not agree on what was actually in the Quran debunks this concept, this idea, this preposterous notion that the Quran was fully memorized in Muhammad's lifetime, and from then till now there's an unbroken chain. This is debunked by my arguments in my original video, which Dawahman missed or failed to address. And so, in conclusion, Dawahman has done nothing more than to, for the most part, strawman or misunderstand my arguments or mispresent my arguments, and just to express a massive ignorance as to the history of Arabic literature and, for example, the role that the Persians played and the nature of sajja and the fact that the Quran contains a lot of sajja, or the fact that many early pre-Islamic and post-Islamic scholars and notables have actually produced works similar to the Quran in terms of sajja and style, or the fact that he quoted quotemined, for example, the quote from Forster Abenoth. I mean, come on, Dawahman. In conclusion, Dawahman was unsuccessful in his attempt to debunk my arguments against Ijaz al Quran on my Orientalist channel.
All right, well, thank you very much, Klingschor and GodlessSaudi. I'm going to end this episode by repeating something that Bertrand Russell said, which reminded me of how Dawahman was trying to address your points. And Bertrand Russell says in his History of Western Philosophy that a stupid man's report of what a clever man says is never accurate. So, Dawahman, we certainly look forward to your reports of what Klingschor has to say. And thank you. Was that too cheesy?
No, I think it's perfect.
Classic.
That's actually this quote fits him nicely. It describes him.